All right. Study number 7, the story of Jacob. We're in Genesis 35, verses 1 to 15. Again, this is Genesis 35, 1 to 15. Let me read that. It says, God said to Jacob, "Arise and go up to Bethel and dwell there. Make an altar there to God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau." So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, "Put away the foreign gods that are among you, and purify yourselves and change your garments. Then let us arise and go up to Bethel, so that I may make there an altar to God who answers me in the day of my distress, and has been with me wherever I have gone." So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods that they had, and the rings that were in their ears. Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that was near Shechem. And as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel. So he called its name Allon Bakuth. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." So he called his name Israel. And God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you." Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. And Jacob set up an altar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. Okay, so just a recap. Last time Jacob met Esau, everything went well, and that was kind of the climax of the story. Jacob had been fighting, struggling, worried his entire life, and everything was solved. He was back in Canaan. He was back in the land of his father, and he was wealthy, he was rich, he had lots of children. Everything basically resolved itself. Everything was good. And so this section is kind of like the denouement, or like the resolution section of the story, where God says to Jacob, "Hey, go back to Bethel." And Bethel is the place in, I think it was chapter 28, where Jacob had a dream about a stairway to heaven. And then he's like, "Oh, this is the house of God." And that's what Bethel means. Bethel means house of God. And the word house of God, or the phrase house of God, Bethel, is often used to refer to like God's temple, or a place where you worship God, right? So he's saying, go back to Bethel. And if you remember what happened at Bethel, there was a stairway, met God, and then afterwards, or during that dream, God blessed Jacob, and he promised him, "Hey, I'm going to bring you back. I'm going to be with you," all this stuff, right? And then so finally now God's made good on his promise, and God's saying to Jacob, "Go back to Bethel. Remember where you made that promise. Remember what happened, and you're going to make me your God now." And up until this time, it's important to note that there's a polytheistic environment. Probably Abraham and Isaac, they were not polytheists, right? They believed and they worshipped the Lord, Yahweh, only. But Jacob himself is in this polytheistic environment, and he's like, I don't necessarily have to worship the God of my fathers. Maybe I'll worship somebody else. But God's saying, you don't know what you bargained for. You wanted this blessing, and this is what you got. You got this blessing, but not only do you get this blessing, you also get me. And part of it is God's followed Jacob and is with him through his entire journey, his entire life. And here is the resolution where he's like, now you're going to go back to that place, and you're going to make good on your vow. Because Jacob promised that, hey, if God brought him back, God took care of him, God made good on his promise, he would in turn worship God. And that's exactly what happens here. Okay, so a couple of points. The first is that you see Jacob telling his household, hey, get rid of all the foreign gods in you and purify yourself, change your garments, and then he buries all the foreign gods. So it's evident his family has been worshiping all these other gods. I mean, they're from Paddan Aram. That's not necessarily a place. I mean, it's just like any other place in the ancient times where they had a bunch of gods that they worshipped, and probably Rachel and Leah grew up worshiping other gods. Obviously, they got to know Jacob's God, but it wasn't necessarily that they were only devoted to this one God, Yahweh. But Jacob's now he's saying, hey, you get rid of all your other gods. And this is weird. This is strange in that time period, because generally it's you can worship multiple gods for multiple different reasons. You worship a storm god to bring water, or you worship the god of war when you need to fight, for different reasons. But you don't worship one god generally for everything. But here Jacob's saying, look at this God. He really made good on everything he said he would do. So we're going to just worship him. We're going to dedicate ourselves to him. Everything else gone. So they finally get rid of all their other idols. But God saying, get rid of them. You're going to dedicate yourself to me. And Jacob tells his family, get rid of them. Okay? So they go to Bethel. And there, God appears to Jacob again. So God appeared to Jacob multiple times through his life, right? The first is at Bethel. And, obviously there was other appearances like the wrestling with God. And finally, he's appearing to God again. So this place where Jacob began his journey, where he was very scared. The first time he went there, he was a single guy, no attachments, no animals, no livestock, no children, no wealth. And then he goes back to that place many, many, many years later. And he's so blessed. So he's so blessed. He's like, hey, I'm going to worship God, right? God reiterates the name change to him. Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. And again, the reiteration of a lot of these promises is pretty important, because it's tracing the blessing throughout Genesis. And that's another point I want to bring up, is just that God reiterates his blessing here. He says, I'm God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. Where does that phrase come from? Be fruitful and multiply? Genesis 1. And it's throughout the Genesis story. And the blessing to Jacob is outflowing of that blessing, the original blessing. And if you remember, the original blessing in Genesis is called into question by human sin. And all throughout the story of Jacob, you see human sin. You see a lot of it. But God's saying, this blessing is still coming down. This blessing is stronger than your sin. And he brings it about. So the reiteration of the blessing is very important, because it's tracing, yes, the blessing is coming down. The blessing's still here. The blessing is still fighting. This blessing is still doing what it's supposed to be doing. God's still blessing in spite of everything, even in the midst of everything. Whatever situations change, this blessing is still a consistent part of Jacob's life. So that's why there's this repeating of this blessing over and over again, because this blessing is so important to the story. The blessing may be the main character of the story, even more of the main character of the story than Jacob is. Genesis is about God and how God blesses. That's the main story. So the blessing is so important, even more important than Jacob with a single individual. You'll see the blessing again with Joseph's story later. You'll see the blessing earlier with Abraham, and even earlier than that with Noah, and etc. Right? All throughout Genesis, the story of the blessing is really important. So how does Jacob respond? Jacob responds exactly the same way as in chapter 28, as he did earlier in his life. He set up a pillar and he poured out oil on it. And the same thing happens again. He calls that place Bethel, the house of the Lord. And it's a wrapping up of this story. It's like bookends. It's the reason why they're like two exact things. It's like, hey, this is the cycle. The cycle is complete. The circle is complete. Jacob's story here is complete, where Jacob comes back to the place and he worships God the way that he's supposed to. No longer to have the vow. The vow is gone because God came through already. And Jacob is just going to submit himself and worship him. So that's kind of the awesome thing about it. And as a Israelite taking a look at this story, you see how the faithfulness of God throughout the course of Jacob's life, changing his moral character from a deceiver into the chaser of God. And so for application, I think one of the main things that we need to kind of land on is we need to see our lives in the story of God, right? Jacob's story is wrapped up. It's closed. But for us, a lot of our story is still continuing. And there are important times and places in the past that we've met God. God said things to us. And we remember those things. But how much do we actually remember them? Like, is that a thread throughout our life? We need to care about those previous moments in our lives. And I encourage us to recommit, to go back to some of the places that, like Jacob did, where, like the actual place, you can see how important the actual places are in this story. Is because places are actually important. And like, we are a very mobile society. We don't really think much about like an actual places and meeting in special holy places. But as human beings, it's kind of in our biology or whatever to care about the actual place we're at. So think about some of the times and the places and that God has really met you. Think about going back there. Think about reliving those kind of commitments and taking your life full circle. Now that you have kids, now that you're older, how has it changed? How has God changed? And you look back on your life and see, how has God been there for you all along? Second point of application is that Jacob's no longer worshiping other gods. He commanded his friends and family to worship God only. And we say, oh yeah, we only worship one God, all this stuff. But in actuality, a lot of us do worship other idols, right? Other gods. And sometimes you start off with just worshiping other gods. You just care about work. You just care about your family. You just care about wealth or different things like that. And you don't care about God at all. But then you meet God and you're just like, oh, I love God. But then you still keep those other things. We still keep caring about these other things. Haven't completely gotten rid of them. So for many of us, we're Christians now. We worship God. But we kind of we're worshiping all sorts of things all at the same time. And God doesn't like that. God is saying, get rid of those other gods. Jacob fully committed himself to God. 100% only going to worship him. Get rid of everything else. Why? Because God's a jealous God. And God, that's the type of worship that God demands. And so for us, we have to ask ourselves this question is, are we worshiping God only? Or are we trying to do this like two-way thing? It's like, oh, I worship God and I worship, and I also care about the other stuff. And often we're like, no, I do worship, I do love God, I do care about God, and that there's room in your heart to care about multiple things. That's the thing. So you can kind of trick yourself into thinking you're worshiping only God when actually God is just one of the things you're worshiping. So I would encourage us in the application to just really think about that. Is God actually the only one we worship? Or are we worshiping him alongside other things that maybe we might not admit to or be as aware of? But really we are worshiping. Maybe it's our kids, our career, our family, our spouse, or the desire for a spouse, or our house, or status at our work, or whatever it is. So that's that study. All right, thanks.